this process has not been smooth or linear. It has very much been bumpy and oftentimes clashing because of competing interests and motivations, etc.
A lot of the current influential decision-making leaders of multilateral institutions had the same background, right? Started from the same position, had the same, and now they are the ones where they're in the spotlight. And this
that our generational fight is around not only localization but inventing new ways of humanitarianism.
Hey guys.
Hey.
Hello.
How you doing?
I feel like you have a plan. Go for it.
Well, we just before we hit record, Ali, you were very briefly referring to a trip you'd just had in Geneva, and you had some unfinished thoughts. Why don't you should start by sharing what you'd like to from that trip?
So still work in progress because I'm still reflecting and thinking about it. But just to give a bit of context, last time I visited Geneva, it was around a year and a half. So it was before this institutional shock, before funding cuts and all that. And just a week ago, I visited it again, and I had the opportunity to meet several people who are at executive level or organizational representatives. And I think I just had this some kind of like a shock, to be honest. And it's mainly because suddenly I realized that we are moving in this sector. We are trying to survive in different, totally different ways. And maybe we are moving in different directions. Maybe the incentives are not the same. And maybe our tactics maybe clashing or something. And the main reason why I'm saying that, because, in the past year and a half, something like that, I've been engaged so much with those local organizations and some international organizations who are rethinking their governance, reimagining their program design, building new partnerships, even integrating AI within their processes, trying to focus, to go back to the basics and build from first principles and all of that. And it was all experimenting and trying new things. And when I had those conversations in Geneva, the themes and the trends in those conversations were a bit different. They were about finding new donors. They were about more individual survival, not like ecosystem or institution or being a humanitarian or something like that. And of course there were so many who were trying to build new partnerships and think in different way and all that. But I felt that before going there, I had this assumption that Geneva is holding the promise. Like Geneva is a place where organizations and institutions and so many individuals, they are doing something big. Like they are working on a reform. They are way advanced than those, let's say, organizations that I was working with and all that. When I went there, I felt that the local organizations that I work with and the initiatives that they were born from what happened last year or from the access limitations, operational challenges, and funding cuts and all that, they were way more advanced. And I think I had this assumption that our generational fight is around not only localization, but inventing new ways of humanitarianism, like new approach, not dropping the old or something like that, just thinking and try to build something new. And maybe that bubble that I was in, those initiatives and organizations and even social enterprise, they are trying to do it. But then when I saw those large institutions, I feel they are just trying to survive. And their way of surviving, nothing shameful about it, but it was, new funding and I felt like, to be honest, like in a simple way, I think There, I got the feeling that the future is the past and tomorrow is yesterday, something like that. Um, yeah, so I felt there is a bit of failure in imagination. I know I'm being harsh on them and
Ali,
what's happening there, but
I was just gonna say, I feel like you're trying to be measured and fair, but when you first were telling me about this, it was visceral. It was like real, like it you can't divorce the this is what's happening intellectually with it. Okay, this is not what I signed up for, and why is this happening? And like all of these things. And I don't know, I don't want you to discount that because it's real.
for me, of course, it's personal. It's 100% personal. But I think like sometimes when you think about cities like Geneva, Brussels, New York, and even Amman, Dhaka, Bangkok, etc., because they are a hub. It's leadership hub for those who are working and collaborating at ecosystem level, at global level. So you think that there are maybe certain kind of like work on initiatives looking at the ecosystem from that side. And of course, there are many. Like I met some people, they are trying to do that, but I didn't expect that they are not at a large scale. And I didn't expect that people are concerned about things we were concerned about a year or two ago. And I don't know, maybe because I live so much sometimes in the future and I try to think about the future and I take it as our generational fight to do that. But I just think that there is a missing link or there is a gap between what grassroots local organizations are trying to do and what's happening at that level. And the last thing that I want to mention on this and what I've been thinking about so much that I understand the struggles. I felt it. But in country operations, we've been struggling with funding cuts since the beginning. Like, I don't think we ever had like enough funding. And we've been struggling with operational challenges and access constraints and strategic gaps and political pressure. Like that's our classic struggle. Like we've been struggling this for ages. So now when I am speaking with those at that level and they are now talking like how can we do, we are very good at this. Like we've been always struggling with this and we always found our way. So I felt like our experiences also are not the same.
The why do you think this kind of gap that you've identified between the reality of your experience in Geneva versus the hope that you took with that trip? Why do you think that gap in observing that gap, why do you think it affected you so much?
Um, I think because like sometimes when you try when you because I have hope that we are going to make a change and do things differently. And part of that hope was that we have leaders somewhere working on something while we are working on something else and others working on something else. So when I went there and I found like, wait a second, that's not reality. That's an assumption. Of course, like, large part of my hope comes from those people who I collaborate with at global level, grassroots level, and those initiatives, they are trying to do things differently. But, I also had some kind of like hope that maybe there is something different there. And again, I want to be fair. Maybe I had some high expectations. Maybe that's the issue because they are working on things, but I just had a bit higher expectations.
I think the
Um,
reality is that, yeah, like we always think the adults in the room, those in power, have the answers, but there are no answers. We're all muddling through this thing together, and the more you sit in it and the more you do, you realize that. But what you made me realize, you were just saying that out loud, I was thinking in real time, Ali, like I have for the last year assumed, okay, the single dominant system is dying. Multiple systems are coming out. And I've been okay with that because for me, we're all moving in the same direction. We're just going to get there in different ways, right? So some of them are going to be the old dominant system is going to kind of carry through, and some of it's going to be hyper local, and some of it's going to be more business oriented. But I've always assumed we're moving in the same direction. But what you just made me think was, oh gosh, what if the different streams are going in opposite directions or if they're clashing? It sounds naive, but I honestly didn't think then what happens? And I don't know.
don't know that principles is the language to use, because if we use the same set of principles, there's going to be a hark to humanitarian principles, right? And I think those not necessarily invalid, but certainly the way they've been operationalized and institutionalized and sort of lived needs reframing and repositioning. And so principles is probably going to take us off on a tangent. But the value point you mentioned, I think, is true. And I don't personally think it needs to be any more complicated than a value of humanity and holding a value of humanity. However, you want to then interpret that, whatever that needs from an operational point of view to be able to then uphold is going to be different and that will look different. And in some instances, maybe it will go like that, but maybe that's okay. Why is that not okay?
Yeah.
This is why I've been thinking so much for the last year about values under pressure, because we can all say we believe in equality and humanity and all of these things, but under pressure, it's like what you're getting to it about survival, Ali, how do different people, different entities make different trade-offs and choices? And there's no one has the answer. There's no perfect answer. Sometimes there's just a bad choice and a worse choice. But how are you making these trade-offs under pressure? And
I
it
think
sounds like to me, Ali, like depending on in the different spaces you're in, you're seeing different things.
That's I see totally different things. Because and I think it's normal. It's totally normal because it's different environments. So that's why I don't even expect that we will look at and see the future in the same way. That's totally normal. But I think maybe because I spend so much time and energy working at new ways, like inventing in new ways, imagining in new ways, redesigning, thinking things in new ways, going back to the basics, like an engine and then take it into small parts and then build it again. So maybe because that was my bubble, those who are like, we are going to make this change and take actions. And then I realized that the institutions, not only in Geneva, but also in other locations and other countries, they are approaching it in a bit different way because they had maybe other things to look at. But there was this thing I want to show you. It's actually what's triggered my thinking. When I was leaving the airport, I saw like advertisement. It's not that clear. Is it clear? At the
the
airport
future of
that I
humanity
don't know
being
if it's
local.
is
That looks
local.
like Save
Yes.
the Children.
Yeah, and I was at the airport and I read that, and my first thing was like, I wonder how many people at this airport understand what does that mean, you know, uh, what that terminology means or something. But then I was thinking about it. The first thing came to mind, but it's not the future. It's been always like local. Um, I just think we approach it in different ways, and this is number one. The second thing that sometimes, to be honest, I feel a bit worried that we are becoming a bit harsh on those. We are one of them, but those who were before, being deployed, doing X, Y, Z, and because I feel like, the international organizations and expats or international employees, they were doing it at that time, it worked, it fit for purpose, it was what was needed at that time. So I feel that sometimes that we are being a bit harsh on them. Um, because I know that even right now, whatever we are going to do, maybe in the future they will realize that we were doing something wrong at this moment or something. So I had all those different thoughts, and then I went into this thinking mode, and I'm still now, you see, like I'm still thinking and reflecting it. Yeah.
Fascinating. You say that, Ali. I'm one of those, right? I lived that caricature expat humanitarian piece, right? A white British male. I flew out from the UK at the drop of a hat, and I went in and I was coordinating and leading responses. In retrospect, and from my own position now, I had no right to have such an influential, authoritative position in, and yet the system enabled me and positioned me and invited me to do that. And so I spent a lot of time over the last 6 or 7 years, really, reflecting on that and thinking about very minutiae encounters and conversations and comments and feedback that I received then that at the time I glossed over and ignored and moved past very quickly. But in retrospect, I'm like, wow, that was incredibly loaded and actually very accurate. But I've had to do a lot of work on myself, and I've had many conversations with other people in a similar space, trying to understand and reflect what was our intention, what was the motive behind that. And was the action and the activity and was our presence, were the things we did there wrong or right? And I can't get past that. I don't think that that terminology is helpful to your point around we've been too harsh. I don't know of anybody, and speaking very personally, I never went and did anything with malintent, right? And yet times have moved on, and arguably time had moved on, that model was still in place. But the intentionality was still very, very, very honest, I think. And I think a lot of people, and let's sort of be generalistic about it, a lot of the current influential decision-making leaders of multilateral institutions had the same background, right? Started from the same position, had the same, and now they are the ones where they're in the spotlight, and this kind of accusation of that model's bad is probably, and I've not had any individual in a position divulged to me, so I am speculating now, but is probably causing a deep-seated anxiety challenge to identity and their own value and their own presence in here, which could well be impacting how they make decisions moving forward. Because do they want to admit that their whole career to date has been based on something that is not right, so to speak? I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. And
It's
it's
profound.
one
And
thing to be able to kind of have the openness to have those deep, honest, hard, reflective moments within yourself when it's just you. But when you're doing it while trying to run a ship and everyone and all eyes are on you, it's a lot harder to be kind of, vulnerable, open, etc. So I mean, it's so interesting. I think that we've all, I think, alluded to this in the past. The sector itself is rupturing, but so is broader society is rupturing right now. So it's like a microcosm within the broader context. And in that moment, there are many people, not all, but many people are navigating this complex change individually and within their communities. And it's just it's so complex. There are so many different threads, and it feels like a big old tangle right now. But I think that's a good thing because this is the moment where something new can get birthed out of it. Like it needs to be this mess so that something good can come out of it. And I think we've all also talked about this. We need to be comfortable sitting in it because if we don't, we snap back to the old way.
but that's emotionally demanding. It carries a lot because you're
So
grieving a
hard.
lot. You're full of tension between optimism, hope, positivity, and jeopardy, anxiety, uncertainty, and they conflict. So it's really hard work. But there's two things that you've each said that have stayed in my mind so far. One, Kim, was your reference to how difficult it is to stay true to the values under pressure, right? And to me, the word pressure is doing a hell of a lot of work in that sentence.
Hmm.
What is the pressure? Where is the pressure coming from? Who is experiencing the pressure? And my assumption, and I'm sure it's far more complicated and nuanced, but my assumption is the pressure from most organizations at a decision-making C-suite leadership level is fiscal and it's survival, right? The pressure that they're
Mhm.
feeling isn't unmet need. Whilst they'd never publicly admit that, right? Because the unmet need needs to always be there from a mission point of view. But I don't think that's the element that is driving a lot of pressure-based conversations. I might be cynical here. You might challenge me on that. Please do, and I hope that it is challenged. And the other bit that was said, and it is linked here, it was your bit, Ali, about a machine and an engine. And you painted that picture of dismantling the engine and then rebuilding it. And I get what you mean. I totally get that. But in dismantling the engine, the assumption that we rebuild another engine in a single form that replaces the previous engine, surely actually we're talking about dismantling the engine and building a dozen engines. And that actually those engines
Mhm.
get built by very, very different people. And maybe they're not engines, right? Maybe
Mhm.
they're other entities and things that get built. I think it's this mindset, this sense that we've come from one thing that's big, and it's the rollout of big, and the pressures that exist within that big thing is this tension between financing, survivability, business model, not necessarily profitable, but certainly viable, and this delivery of need against this sense of that's ruptured, and now Lots of things are coming and they're going to be going in different directions and having different motives with them. This is hard stuff to process and get your head
Yeah.
around. And if it's all wrapped up in was everything I've done and is my career legitimate and is my background and experience right and valid and am I being accused of being neo-colonialist for the last 20, 30 years? How on earth are we coming up with creative solutions? I don't know how it's possible in that mindset.
Yeah. I think from my side and the way I look at it is that if I want to put my operational hat, I think what one of the things that I learned in being in country operations and dealing with crisis nonstop is moving on. And this is one. Number two, continue building. Even if you are struggling with XYZ, you continue moving forward. Even if you don't really know exactly which direction, but you continue. But there are some moments where I like to pause, zoom out, and think about the whole system. And what I mentioned, for example, about Geneva and the other cities and the engine and all that is one of those moments where I try to understand how all this is functioning and what's happening and how can we all feed into each other. And in a way or another, it takes me back to our last conversation, the last episode when we were talking about, this one umbrella or one container as Kim described it. And, because I try sometimes to see how can we all feed into something. Um, but I really like what you mentioned because it's, when I'm saying an engine and take it into pieces and try to build it again, something, you are right. Maybe we are not going to build one, maybe it will be 100, or maybe we are not going to build an engine or something like that. In the end of the day, I think we will have to look at this from different perspectives and different angles. And maybe we are going to do it in different ways. And I think that's totally fine.
So, Thomas, what you made me think of it in a different way, which is interesting. So, in this analogy, made me think of like, so let's say energy. We had one dominant way of meeting our energy needs, and then there was wind and solar and wave power and all these things. And you're right, I think that is going to be the way, right? It's going to be a mix, a combination, and in every community the combination looks different based on like what your needs are, etc. But there is not going to be one dominant way to meet the energy needs. But to what I had said earlier, this process has not been smooth or linear. It has very much been bumpy and oftentimes clashing because of competing interests and motivations, etc. And I don't know why that somehow makes me feel better because there is an analogy that I can kind of fit it in, and it's hopefully going to be okay because I think in general we are moving in a direction. We know that it's kind of inevitable that there is going to have to be a mix of ways that we meet our energy needs. But if the container is meeting social good needs, the needs of humanity, if that's the container, there's going to be so many modalities to get there. And we're so used to having just like that one common dominant one.
And I think this is where hope comes in, and optimism, because I think the human spirit and people having a value of humanity and wanting to enact it is going to embody and will shape that container. Um, the challenge is in letting go of the control over defining that container and having nice, neat terminology and packaging of said container component parts. That's going to be messy. But I
And
think
as someone who really enjoys control, that it has been a learning journey, a real
yeah,
journey.
there's so much in psychodynamic theory about this, about the sense of lack, the sense of desire, the desire for control that you have, and the lack of control feeding anxiety and activating nervous system and all the rest of it. And I've written a blog that's going to come out soon about knowledge encounters and how you embrace different bits of knowledge. And it's not actually about the knowledge that you're receiving because you get that everywhere, right? People will have knowledge encounters when they're listening to this whilst they're driving or walking the dog or whatever, right? They'll hear something. It's not about the knowledge you receive. It's about your ability to receive said knowledge, right? What moment are you in? Is there too many distractions? What mindset have you got? Who's presenting the knowledge? Is it an authoritative, credible voice that you respect? Is it packaged in a visual way, a written way, an audible way? Like the way you receive information is central, paramount here, and you've got to have an enabling and open ability to receive this knowledge. And a way to do that is by calming down your nervous system.
Yes, I'm also on that journey. You mentioned before that there's a lot of, you know, both within what's happening within our work world and within the world, there's so much change and it takes a hit on your nervous system. And I have been feeling that, frankly, the last couple weeks really strongly, and it's in your body. And the other day, I was so tired and I was just kind of wandering around. You know, when you're like in that daze and you're just kind of wandering around and either you're doom scrolling or you're staring out the window. And I was trying to figure out what was wrong because I couldn't pinpoint. There wasn't anything, one thing that I was reacting to. And then I realized my body was processing grief. There was no one moment. No one had died, nothing bad. It was just the collective grief that was trying to be processed in just trying to exist through this moment and do so by while living my values under pressure. And so you talked about values under pressure at the institutional level, Thomas, but I like thinking about it in that way because every micro moment of interaction, of relation, is an opportunity to live your values under pressure. But it does take a toll. And I think we will burn out if we don't acknowledge that. So
Yeah.
sometimes I am proactive and I paint and I exercise, and sometimes I get under the covers and I watch a TV show.
And both are fine. There was something we spoke about slightly before this about walking the talk in this sense, right? And both of you have got experiences and lived experiences of recognizing this requirement to shift mindset and to open up and be reflective to enable you to embrace the change in a more constructive, open, reflective, creative, curious way. I just wondered if either or both of you wanted to say a little bit about how you are going about that as current practitioners within your worlds.
Yeah, let me give you some examples. Just few hours before this conversation, I was having a meeting with a CEO and executive management, and they've been working on changing their model, both governance model as well as program design and operations model, and like from different angles. And it's been over a year journey, extremely challenging. But in the beginning of the journey, the decision was we want to do things differently, and whatever risks will come with it, challenges, issues, we will accept them and proceed. So when we started that journey, we identified the values and the main vision or goal that we have, we locked them. And then we started experimenting. So I felt at that time, the leadership and the executive management, they share their message, they share their value, and then walked it and then went through this journey. That's one example. Another one, I think last year I have worked with so many local organizations that they wanted to have this hyper model where they could break that dependency and they have certain ways to generate their own income and have revenue and XYZ. And of course, they had this identity question between whether are they non-profit or profit, are they still humanitarian or not, and all these different identity questions. But the decision was that we need to do things differently and we need to invent that. So they started experimenting and all that. And for me, the values and the principles and the vision about breaking that dependency, they put it, blocked it, and then they started experimenting. So just those are simple examples of people who put certain values or principles and then they walk the talk.
Kim, what's your experience?
Are you talking about at the personal or at the institutional level?
I was referring to institutional, but if you've got a personal reflection, I'd love to hear that as well.
I mean, at the personal level, I would say that how as a parent, when you're teaching your kids to name their emotions, you teach yourself to at the same time. Like oftentimes you are growing with them because you're trying to model for them, and then you realize that you're evolving at the same time. It's not a perfect analogy. I'm not saying that
No, but
people
it
that I work
resonates
with
and
are like
connects.
children. But I do think the last year of holding space for others has taught me a whole lot about myself, because in order to hold a safe space for others to process their feelings, you have to come as an authentic, vulnerable human yourself. If you don't, it doesn't work. And so I don't know that I would have done that if I hadn't had to do it for others, to be quite honest with you, because it's not necessarily what I'm most comfortable with. But doing it in a professional setting for that purpose has helped me to kind of be open and honest about how I'm processing things with myself, because so I could do it for others. So that's at a personal level. I think at walking the talk. So my experience comes from working for Humanitarian. I've been here for over a decade. It's shifted and evolved in many different ways while I've been here. But one of our values is actually walk the talk. It's one of the values. And the organization, I will say, actually does live its values. It's embedded in kind of our meetings and our everything, the whole thing. And whether, nothing is perfect. We don't always do it perfectly, but it is very much front of mind of how do we do this in every encounter. And one of the things, I mean, Ali, you're talking about survival, that we've been internally kind of acknowledging and struggling with attention is we're a mission-based nonprofit, right? Which is trying to do what we want to do and what we set out to do, but you also have your business model. And so the tension, and some of that business model is fee for service, and some of it is grant-based, and it's a whole mix. So how do you, and right now that is under a lot of constraint. So how do you live the tension of meeting the mission and making like forward leaning decisions and not kind of locking yourself into reactive survival mode when you're on this line, you're in this environment? It's constant tension that we're like actively surfacing and trying to talk about, so that you can make at least the trade-offs with eyes wide open, I guess, is how you walk the talk. Because they're all trade-offs, and none of the trade-offs are going to be 100% perfect. What about
No,
you?
agreed. Well, it's interesting. I had a 6 or 7 year journey with Save in East and Southern Africa, going through this process, and I was helped along that journey by the requirements of operational pivot during COVID, and the sort of internal depth reflections that we all went through collectively during Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. So I've had I think quite and in retrospect, I've had a lengthy, probably privileged journey through this change that many have had to very abruptly be forced to go through over the last 12-month process. And so I'm quite at peace with myself on that journey. And I've made my career choices to reflect that, I think. But I was recently this week having a conversation with someone who is sort of spearheading the strategy refresh of their organization, INGO, and they had, as a sort of strategy team, had embraced and recognized the fact that ecosystemically was the direction of travel. But what they were struggling with was two things. One, which was the presentation of the problem to me, was how do we do that? We've not done that before. So how do we do that? What does that look like? And so we had a conversation about that. But then what unearthed in the conversation was the second thing, which was actually that speaks to core identity of the individuals in that team, because suddenly it's positioning them in a different place to where they have from their own point of view come to the work through an attempt to live their purpose, right? And so by kind of unearthing this, you're sharing and you're circulating and socializing some quite raw emotion that people are either suppressing, or they're on their own internal narrative journey to understand, and that needs sensitive handling. It needs intentional handling, and people shouldn't shy away from that and recognize that, because the way I frame that, the way I imagine that is it's people going through trauma. It's not kind of gunshot trauma, but it's trauma. It's self-reflective in uncomfortable ways, but we need to, and that's essential to me. That's a central tenet of thinking ecosystemically, is having that whole visibility of your position within an ecosystem, the influence you have on that ecosystem, and the powers and the forces that are shaping your presence and how you show up in that system. And these are forces shaping the way people show up in ecosystems. And if you
Okay,
ignore them, then you're only doing a fraction of the job.
can I push back on that just a little bit? And I don't, maybe it's not pushing back. I don't even know if I agree with what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. So I agree
Go
with
for
you,
it.
Thomas. Like, I think this is a moment, right? And there's a lot of people that are navigating a lot of complex things at a personal level, at the organizational level, while trying to keep the lights on. And that should not be minimized or discounted. And maybe we can invent new ways to navigate this better because so many people are going through it collectively. And at the same time, Ali, you said in the beginning, like, people in country offices have been dealing with this stuff forever. Like, money comes, money goes, we have to pivot, like, we don't, the rug gets pulled out from under us. We've just gotten on with it and not really complained because we didn't have the luxury of dealing with it. So, I mean, that, I don't know, I'm not saying that that's good or bad. It's just like, it's a truth, it's a fact. I don't know.
I think from my perspective, we have that experience. Like, and okay, if the leadership at certain level they didn't practice that, let's say, because it's a bit stable. They are focusing more strategic direction, portfolio management, liquidity, XYZ. That's totally fine. But maybe that's exactly the right time to tap into the other, the team members who has that experience. But I also want to mention something here. I think it's very important to distinguish between strategic decision and identity decision because in the past year, I think that was one of the dilemmas that I faced personally, and also those organizations that I was supporting. There were certain decisions, they were strategic, they could bring them certain benefits when it comes to positioning, financial gains, XYZ, but they were not meeting their identity. So they let go of that to take identity decisions. And the same on the other side. Sometimes there are some identity decisions that might not give you strategic position. So I think sometimes it's very important to distinguish between those both. But from my perspective, if we are trying to make a change, change will not happen if we are excluding people. And especially in a sector that is complex, it's organized complexity with all those different layers and area, site, country, region, global XYZ, we need to bring people together and we need to bring those bridges and tap into the different experiences that the people have. And there are some meetings where I sit there and we are talking about liquidity, exchange rate, um, diversify funding and donors and XYZ. There are certain meetings where I sit there and we talk about impact, program, and optimizing operations, etc. I think that's fine. But the main important thing is that we keep the core, those values that we were talking about, or that's the core of our works. It must be there, regardless what type of conversation that we are having.
It's fascinating you talk about identity versus strategy decisions, Ali. I was teaching on a course with a group of civil society representatives this week, and we talked exactly about that. We talked about identity-based decision making, and in identity we referred to kind of how people's relationship with power, their relationship with voice, visibility, legitimacy, tolerance for compromise, how do they as an individual show up against those topics, right? And how does their identity against those connect with or push against the issue with which they are approaching? Now, the context of that was in advocacy. So it was talking about advocacy based issues. And the strategy side were the kind of modes of activity for advocacy. Is it public? Is it media? Is it civil rights, grassroots activism, diplomacy? These different approaches to advocacy. And is someone's identity shaping the strategy? And actually, that's not what's required for the cause and the issue. And so the session was talking about maturing your identity, starting with an awareness of where you are, to then be able to understand, is that the right approach or not? And that takes a lot though, right? There's a lot of internal reflection that's required on that. The other thing I heard that I thought was resonant was on decision making. There are decisions that you can roll back on, and there are decisions that you can't. And this came completely outside the sector. It was this guy, Rory Sutherland, in the marketing world, Ogilvy space. He used an example of Amazon, right? He's like, introducing Amazon Prime is a decision you can roll back on, right? If suddenly the finances don't work on it, or the people reject the concept of subscribing to it, then you just stop it and you go back to what you were doing. The decision to open up a $3 billion distribution plant in City X, that's not really a decision you can roll back on, right? So the due diligence and the degrees of certainty that you need to start going into each of those is very different. but I do worry that maybe we're applying same levels of due diligence on problems, regardless of whether they're ones you can roll back on or not.
Well, it's also a question of time. I mean, this came up in a webinar that Ali and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
were on a couple of weeks ago, where it's like, short, medium term time and then deep time. So, all of what you're talking about is when you're making real big strategic decisions for like even medium to deep time. Yeah, you want to really make the right calls, but then sometimes you're having to make a decision in like a very short period of time from a survival perspective. So how do you acknowledge how the constraints you're in shape your choices while still not trying to get locked into that reactive survival mode? Like it is a balance, knowing that like, yeah, I want to be able to sit and reflect and make the right strategic choice, but sometimes like, can I make payroll?
And that speaks to, I think, a topic that we'll have to pick up on the next episode that you raised, Kim, about navigating nuance, right? And how does this come and how does this play out? And I'm also thinking, as someone who might be listening to this conversation, I'd imagine, I'd like to think that there's a lot of resonance and understanding and connection with what we're saying. But I can imagine the question that they'd be screaming at us if they could have a two-way conversation was, so what? Right? What do we do about all this? And that's one that, I mean, there are ways to talk about that and there are things that people can look at and do, but we certainly haven't touched on that today. So maybe that's something else we should pick up on a future conversation.
What I usually tell my friends and also even the leaders that I work with, that in order to create the future, you have to live in the future long enough before it happens. So you have to sit first, reflect and think, then imagine that future and sit with it, like sit with that future that you are imagining, and then go back to the present. So I feel like, and for me, that's what I learned also in this sector, and especially working at strategic level, that sometimes you need to live in the future before it happens, and then you go back and build the present. But to be honest, and I think we say this in each episode, that as long as we have more questions and we are approaching them with curiosity, things are okay. No need to rush for the answers.
One of the final lines in this blog I'm putting out is the future is unlikely to yield answers, but that's not the point. I think for me, it's not about answers; it's about better questions, and that's, I think, what you're saying, Ali. That's exactly it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Should we end it there?
Thanks, folks.
Yeah, that was good.
Any final comment, remark? How are you closing this? How are you leaving this conversation? Staying curious. I like that, Ali. Kim, how are you leaving this?
I'm leaving it reflecting on the fact that we always start talking about structures and we always end talking about interpersonal.
That's nice.
I'm leaving thinking about the next conversation. What comes next? So maybe we record tomorrow and release in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, but it was really nice actually expressing those thoughts and sharing with you what's in my head. It also feels a bit of relief.
You gotta get it out.
Yeah.
Even if you don't, even if it doesn't get untangled, it feels better when it's out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do like Geneva.
It helps with sense-making and processing.
You want to be invited back.
Yes, nice chocolates. Good conversation.
There's a lot of that sentence of "let's not go back to Geneva" is doing a lot of work, and so let's just leave that there.
Yeah.
I'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.